Why was Eleanor Roosevelt called the People's First Lady?
While several first ladies before her had also been active in the nation's life. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, wife of 32nd President of the United States Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, stands out as one of the country's most active first ladies and as a woman of enormous accomplishment in her own right. During her husband's administration, which began in the dark days of the Great Depression, 1929 to 39, and continued as the world again went to war, Eleanor Roosevelt acted not only as an advisor to the president, but as the president's eyes and ears on the nation, traveling in a way that his physical condition prevented him from doing. From the start, Eleanor Roosevelt remained in constant communication with the American people. She was known for her weekly press conferences, numbering some 350 by the end of the Roosevelt presidency, that were open only to women reporters. In 1934 she began a radio program, which became so popular that she was soon dubbed the First Lady of Radio. Beginning in 1936 she authored a daily column called My Day, which was syndicated to newspapers around the country. These forums gave the First Lady an unprecedented voice in American life, and gave Americans a clear understanding of their First Lady and her concerns. Concerned about the effects of the Great Depression on American children, she was instrumental in creating the National Youth Administration, which helped high school and university students complete their studies before joining the workforce. She was a champion of minority groups, declaring that the right to work should know no color lines, and resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution when the group refused to allow black singer Marian Anderson, 1897 to 1993, to perform at Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt was known for getting out among the people. She lectured frequently and made other public appearances in which she met and spoke face to face with the American people. A famous cartoon depicted a coal miner pausing in his work to exclaim, "For gosh sakes! Here comes Mrs. Roosevelt." During World War II, 1939 to 45, she made a remarkable 23,000-mile trip across the South Pacific, where she untiringly visited American GIs in field hospitals and on the lines. MRS. Roosevelt was an advocate for the people, and it just so happened that she lived in the White House. A beloved First Lady who actively supported liberal causes and humanitarian concerns. She has been a model to subsequent First Ladies and women politicians and activists.
Why does the President of the United States give a State of the Union address?
The U.S. Constitution requires the President to annually present a joint session of Congress, attended by representatives and senators, with a status report on the nation. Presidents George Washington, 1732 to 1799, and John Adams, 1735 to 1826. The first and second presidents delivered their messages in person. Thereafter the State of the Union was sent as a written message, which was read in Congress. But President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, delivered his messages in person, including that of January 1918, when he delivered the 14 points his formulation of a peace program for Europe once World War I. 1914 to 18, had ended. Since Franklin D. Roosevelt 1882 to 1945, held office, beginning in 1933, all U.S. presidents have made formal addresses to Congress.
How were Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt related?
The two men, among America's most well-known presidents, were distant cousins. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, was born in New York City, and after a career in public service that included organizing the first volunteer cavalry regiment that was known as the Rough Riders. The ardent outdoors enthusiast became vice president in 1901, when President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, died in office later that year. On September 14, Teddy Roosevelt succeeded him as president. He was elected in his own right in 1904 and went on to serve until 1909. Spending nearly 2 full terms in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was President of the United States when he walked his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, down the aisle on March 17, 1905. The young woman was marrying her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, who had been courting her since he entered college at Harvard in 1900. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York. Like his fifth cousin Theodore, Franklin went on to a life of public service, which bore some remarkable similarities to that of his cousin. Both Theodore and Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, 1897 to 98 and 1913 to 20, respectively. And both were governors of New York, 1899 to 1900 and 1929 to 1933, respectively. As presidents, both served the nation for more than one term, but Franklin Roosevelt made history for being the only president to be elected for third and fourth terms. In 1951, the U.S. Congress voted in favor of the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidential tenure to just 2 terms. Both served the country in times of conflict. For Theodore it was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, which he was instrumental in ending with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on September 5, 1905, and for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the so-called Big Three leaders, along with Britain's Sir Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965, and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953. He coordinated the Allied nations' effort against Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II, 1939–45. He, too, was a champion of peace, having been central in laying plans for the United Nations. It's an interesting note, however, that when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president in 1912, he was opposed by his young Democratic cousin Franklin, then a state senator in New York, who supported Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, in the presidential race. After Wilson was elected, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post that delighted him for combining his vocation, politics, with his avocation, ships, and one that certainly furthered his political career. By the end of World War I, 1914–18, Franklin Roosevelt was a well-known national figure. Theodore and Franklin also shared an interest in outdoor activities. But Franklin's participation in sports was curtailed when he was stricken with polio in August 1921. The 39-year-old Roosevelt was paralyzed for a time. And though he later regained movement and was able to walk with braces, he never fully recovered. Through fierce determination he continued his life of public service, becoming president in 1933. He saw the country through two of its most trying periods, the Great Depression, 1929–39, and World War II, 1939–45. He died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage in April 1945.
Who were the Habsburgs?
The Habsburgs were Europe's most powerful royal family. Even if one chose to argue the point of power, there can be no arguing the longevity of the House of Habsburg. They supplied Europe with a nearly uninterrupted stream of rulers for more than 600 years. Also spelled Habsburg, which is closer to the pronunciation, Habsburg, the name came from the castle of Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle, built during the early 11th century in Switzerland. The first member of the family to bear the name was Count Werner I, who died in 1096. It was Werner's descendant, Rudolf I, 1218–1291, who was elected King of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire in 1273, when Rudolf conquered Austria 3 years later. He established that country as the family's new home. Austria, Bohemia, Germany, Hungary, and Spain were among the European states ruled by the House of Habsburg. With only one exception, the Habsburg family also ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 1438, when Albert II was elected, until 1806. It was the reign of Emperor Charles V. During the 16th century that the Habsburg influence reached its high water mark, when in 1496 Spain's Philip I, called Philip the Handsome, 1478–1506, married Joan of Castile. 1479–1555, it assured that their son Charles V, 1500–1558, would inherit the crown of Spain, which he did in 1516. Charles was grandson to Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He also inherited the rest of what by then was a vast empire, and he ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 until 1556. Charles V is considered the greatest of all the Habsburgs, though he did face problems. Chief among these were the Protestant Reformation, opposition from his lifelong rival, Francis I. 1494 to 1547, King of France, and the Ottoman Turks, who were at the height of their power during his reign. Nevertheless, he was a successful ruler and his accomplishments included Spain's conquest of lands in the New World Mexico at the hands of Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547, and Peru, by Francisco Pizarro. c. 1475 to 1541. In 1867 the Habsburg Empire was reorganized as the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. That monarchy was dissolved in 1918, after World War I. With the Treaty of Versailles establishing new boundaries for the successor states.
What were scalawags?
Scalawags was a derogatory term used by white Southerners to refer to those white Southerners who supported or were sympathetic to the goals of the Republican lawmakers during Reconstruction. 1865 to 77, the years of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. The Republican Party was the object of much contempt in the American South during the mid to late 1860s. Congress was dominated by radical Republicans, who were able to overturn presidential vetoes to achieve their goals. While President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, supported a lenient policy toward the Southern rebel states, Congress favored a more gradual approach to reunification. In order to prevent another resurgence in the South, Congress delayed the readmission of former Confederate states until Republican governments could be established in them. Congress was also determined to enact legislation and sponsor constitutional amendments that would extend the rights of citizenship to freed slaves. After 4 years of brutal combat during the war, many Southerners saw fit to side with the Union and with the Republican lawmakers who were determining Reconstruction policy. President Andrew Johnson had proved himself an ineffectual leader, and Congress had mustered enough votes to repeatedly override him. In fact, they impeached him in 1868. Some whites in the South, contemptuously called scalawags, joined with Northern businessmen and politicians, derisively called carpetbaggers, as well as the freed slaves to forge a new South.
What was the kitchen cabinet?
It was the name given to President Andrew Jackson's unofficial group of advisors, who reportedly met with him in the White House kitchen. The group included the then Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, 1782 to 1862, who went on to become vice president during Jackson's second term, and president from 1837 to 1841, F. P. Blair. 1791 to 1876, editor of the Washington Post, who was active in American politics and later helped get Abraham Lincoln elected to office, 1860, and Amos Kendall, 1789 to 1869. A journalist who was also a speechwriter for Jackson and went on to become U.S. Postmaster General. The Kitchen Cabinet was influential in formulating policy during Jackson's first term, 1829 to 33. Many believe because the president's real cabinet, which he convened infrequently, had proved ineffective. But Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, drew harsh criticism for relying on his cronies in this way. When he reorganized the cabinet in 1831, the Kitchen Cabinet disbanded. Jackson's favoritism to his circle of friends did not end with the Kitchen Cabinet, however. During his presidency, the spoils system was in full force. Jackson gave public offices as rewards to many of his loyal supporters. Though the term spoils system was popularized during Jackson's terms in office, it was his friend, Senator William Marcy, who coined the phrase when he stated, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy." Jackson was not the first president to grant political powers to his party's members, and the practice continued through the 19th century. However, beginning in 1883, laws were passed that gradually put an end to, or at least limited, the spoils system.
Which U.S. president held the first press conference?
President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924. Was the first president to routinely assemble the press to answer questions for the public. On March 15, 1913, shortly after his inauguration, he called the first presidential press conference. More than 100 news reporters attended the event. Decades later, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, became known for his frequent use of the televised press conference to directly communicate with Americans.
What was Teapot Dome?
Teapot Dome was a notorious political scandal that was on a level with Watergate, 1972. While the early 1920s abuses of power affected President Warren G. Harding, 1865 to 1923, it was not Harding who was implicated in the crimes. Albert Bacon Fall, 1861 to 1944, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, secretly transferred government oil lands at Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private use, and he did so without a formal bidding process. Fall leased the Elk Hills naval oil reserves to American businessman Edward L. Doheny, 1856 to 1935, in exchange for an interest-free loan of $100,000. Fall made a similar arrangement with another businessman, Harry F. Sinclair, 1876 to 1956, of Sinclair Oil Corporation, leasing the Teapot Dome reserves in exchange for $300,000 in cash, bonds, and livestock. The scandal was revealed in 1922. And committees of the U.S. Senate and a special commission spent the next 6 years sorting it all out. By the time the hearings and investigations were concluded in 1928, Harding had died. Fall had resigned from office and taken a job working for Sinclair, all three players Doheny, Sinclair, and Fall had faced charges, and the government had successfully sued the oil companies for the return of the lands. The punishments were light considering the serious nature of the charges. Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe, fined $100,000, and sentenced to a year in prison. While Doheny and Sinclair were both indicted but later acquitted of the charges against them, which included conspiracy and bribery.
What does the Security Council do?
According to the UN Charter, the functions and powers of the Security Council are to maintain international peace and security in accordance with the principles and purposes of the United Nations, to investigate any dispute or situation which might lead to international friction, to recommend methods of adjusting such disputes or the terms of settlement, to formulate plans for the establishment of a system to regulate armaments, to determine the existence of a threat to the peace or act of aggression, and to recommend what action should be taken, to call on members to apply economic sanctions and other measures not involving the use of force to prevent or stop aggression, to take military action against an aggressor, to recommend the admission of new members, to exercise the trusteeship functions of the United Nations in strategic areas, and to recommend to the General Assembly the appointment of the Secretary General and, together with the Assembly, to elect the judges of the International Court of Justice.
What were the fireside chats?
They were radio broadcasts of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's, 1882 to 1945, messages to the American people. FDR began making the informal addresses on March 12, 1933. During the long and dark days of the Great Depression. In his efforts to reassure the nation, FDR urged listeners to have faith in the banks and to support his New Deal measures. Sometimes beginning his talks with my friends, the radio broadcasts were enormously successful and attracted more listeners than even the most popular broadcasts during this golden age of radio. FDR continued his fireside chats into the 1940s, as Americans turned their attention to the war effort.
What was the Doomsday Book?
It is an important document surviving from the reign of England's William I, c. 1028–1087, a Norman who had conquered England in 1066 to become king. He ordered the survey so that he could have a complete record of England's lands, property owners, and resources. He used this information to his advantage, even taking possession of some properties thereafter. The census is considered an excellent record of Europe's Middle Ages, 500–1350.
What are the bodies and agencies of the United Nations?
The UN's Charter establishes 6 main bodies and explains their duties and operating methods. The General Assembly is the major forum, all member nations are represented there. And the Assembly can discuss any issue that is deemed relevant and important to the UN. The Security Council has the major responsibility for preserving peace. The Economic and Social Council investigates economic questions and works to improve living standards. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative body, helping all organs do their work. The Trusteeship Council assists non-self-governing territories, and the International Court of Justice hears disputes between member nations. Except for the last one, all bodies convene in the UN headquarters in New York City. The International Court of Justice meets in The Hague. Since the Charter was written in 1945, the United Nations has established numerous agencies, committees, and commissions to help carry out its work around the world. Among those that are most well known to the public are the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which encourages the exchange of ideas among nations. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, which assists children and adolescents worldwide, particularly those in devastated areas or developing countries. The World Health Organization, WHO, which promotes high health standards around the globe. The International Labour Organization, ILO, which works to improve labor conditions and protect workers. And the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which addresses currency and trade issues.
Why was President Andrew Johnson impeached?
In late February 1868, 9 articles of impeachment were brought against Andrew Johnson over political and ideological differences between the President and Congress. Johnson self-educated, self-made, and outspoken inspired people to either love or hate him. A Southern Democrat in the U.S. Senate. He broke bonds of home and party when he swore allegiance to the Union after the outbreak of the Civil War, 1861–65. This he did because of his strong personal belief that the Southern states had violated the U.S. Constitution when they seceded from the Union. Soon this Tennessean and former Democrat shared the Union Party ticket with Republican Abraham Lincoln. 1809 to 1865, as he ran for re-election to the presidency in the fall of 1864. Inaugurated in March. Vice President Johnson became President Johnson that fateful mid-April day when Lincoln was shot as he sat watching a play at Washington, D.C.'s Ford's Theater. But Johnson's troubles had already begun. As he and Lincoln took the oath of office in March, Johnson appeared to be drunk. Some attributed this to the fact that he was recovering from typhoid fever. But one journalist labeled him a drunken clown, and a group of senators began calling for his resignation. Lincoln met with his vice president for the first and what would turn out to be the last time on April 14, just hours before Lincoln's life was claimed by assassin John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865. As president, Johnson's true colors shine through. Again allegiant to his homeland, his policies toward southern states were lenient. Ever class-conscious, he used the power of his office to demonstrate to the southern aristocrats, whom he openly despised, just how far a poor man from North Carolina had come, as a states' rights advocate. He was ever watchful of any congressional bills that might impinge upon the freedoms of the individual states. And as a racist, he proved reticent to grant rights or protection to blacks. All of these traits combined to create sticking points between Johnson and Congress. In February 1866, Congress voted to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, a War Department agency that assisted blacks and whites. But Johnson vetoed the measure, and Congress was unable to overturn his veto. Later that year, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a bill that extended citizenship to freed slaves and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws. Believing this piece of legislation overstepped the boundaries of central government, he felt this sort of lawmaking was up to each state. He again vetoed it. But this time Congress mustered the votes it needed to overturn a presidential veto. It was the first of many veto overrides during Johnson's administration. Feeling Johnson was ill-equipped to run the nation, Congress moved its meeting time so that it could keep an eye on the executive branch. Meantime, Congress was guiding Reconstruction policy. The southern states were being run by their military administrators, reporting to General Ulysses S. Grant. 1822 to 1885, in 1867 Congress passed a law, the Tenure of Office Act, preventing the President from removing any cabinet member without Congress's permission. By this time, Congress has already begun to consider whether Johnson ought to be impeached. That fall, President Johnson pardoned many Confederate generals and officials, further raising the ire of Congress and the nation. Johnson's popularity was waning. The following February, Grant attempted to replace Edwin Stanton, 1814 to 1869, as Secretary of War. Stanton, who was favored by Congress, refused to leave his office, physically chaining himself to his desk. Congress viewed Johnson's move as a violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and proceeded to hold impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives. Within a few days, the House approved a resolution of impeachment. On March 13, the trial began in the Senate. On May 19 the Senate voted on one of the articles of impeachment. It was considered to be the one most likely to receive the two-thirds majority vote required to convict the president. The measure failed by one vote. Subsequent votes resulted in the same tally. While many believe Johnson was an inadequate and unpopular president who made numerous mistakes while in office, many others believe he was not guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors called for in Article 2, Section 4, of the Constitution. In fact, the law that he was accused of breaking, the Tenure of Office Act, was later overturned as unconstitutional.
What were the highlights of the Ming Dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming Dynasty. 1368 to 1644, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself, meaning bright or brilliant. Architects working during this period produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. Ming porcelain, bronze, and lacquerware are coveted collector's items today. Additionally, the novel and drama flourished. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people on the horizon. In 1644 the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912. Nevertheless, it was the Ming, and not the Manchu, who formed the last great and truly Chinese dynasty.
Was Indira Gandhi related to Mohandas Gandhi?
No, the two were not related, except by events. After India achieved independence in 1947, the country's first Prime Minister was Jawaharlal Nehru. 1889 to 1964, who had been a follower of Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948. The great leader of India's long struggle for autonomy from Great Britain. During his entire tenure, 1947 to 64, as leader of India, Nehru was assisted by his only child, Indira, 1917 to 1984, who in 1942 married a man named Feroz Gandhi of no relation to Mohandas Gandhi. Indira Gandhi took an active role in India's national affairs. After her father died, she went on to become Prime Minister in 1966. However, Hers was a troubled tenure. Found guilty of employing illegal election practices. Indira Gandhi was ousted by her political opponents in 1977. Determined to return to power, she was re-elected to parliament in 1980 and again served as prime minister until her death in 1984. She was assassinated by two of her own security guards. Sikhs who were motivated by religious reasons. Her son and successor, Rajiv Gandhi, 1944 to 1991, was also assassinated, in 1991.
Who were the Romanovs?
The Romanov family ruled Russia from 1613 until 1917, when Nicholas II, 1868 to 1918, was overthrown by the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 17. The dynasty was established by Michael Romanov, grandnephew to Ivan the Terrible, who ruled from 1533 to 1584. There were 18 Romanov rulers, including the much-studied Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796. As the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 to 1917, likely suffered not only the recrimination that was due him, but the public hostility that had accumulated over centuries of ruthless Romanov leadership. Nicholas's difficulties came to a head when he got Russia involved in World War I, 1914-18. Which produced serious hardships for the Russian people and for which there was little public support. Once Tsar Nicholas was overthrown, and later killed, in the Russian Revolution. 1905-17, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, 1870-1924. Set about extracting Russia from the conflict by agreeing to sever concessions to Germany. Oddly enough, the Romanov family had, in the 14th century, originated with a German nobleman, Andrew Kabila, who had emigrated to Russia.
What are England's royal houses?
England's royal houses are simply families, including ancestors, descendants, and kin. Since 1066, England's rulers have come from a series of 10 royal houses: Normandy, ruled 1066 to 1135, Blois, 1135 to 54, Plantagenet, 1154 to 1399, Lancaster, 1399 to 1471, York, 1471 to 85, Tudor, 1485 to 1603, Stuart, 1603 to 49, restored 1660 to 1714, Hanover, 1714 to 1901, Saxe-Coburg, 1901 to 10, and Windsor, 1910 to present. Prior to the establishment of the House of Normandy, England had been ruled by Saxons and Danes since 802. The first king of the House of Normandy was William I, also known as William the Conqueror c. 1028 to 1087, who was the son of the French Duke of Normandy. William invaded England in 1066 on the death of Edward the Confessor and the accession of Harold II. c. 1022–1066. Ousting Harold, William was coronated at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. William's grandson, Stephen, was all that consisted of the short-lived reign of the House of Blois. Named such since Stephen was the Count of Blois and Chartres. Though he was raised in the court of his uncle, King Henry I, whom he succeeded. The House of Plantagenet, also called the House of Anjou, included the 10-year reign 1189–99 of Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157–1099, who fought his father Henry II, 1068–1135, and his brothers for control of the throne. Richard's military prowess made him the hero of romantic legends. Thereafter, two contending branches of the House of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, vied for the crown in the infamous War of the Roses, 1455–85. The struggle finally ended when Henry VII, a Lancaster, ascended the throne and married into the House of York, reuniting the two sides of the family under the newly minted House of Tudor. The Tudors were a famous lot, remembered for the reigns of Henry VIII. 1509–47, and his daughters, Mary I, 1553–1558, and Elizabeth I, 1558–1603. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, whose reign was interrupted by the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1599–1658. The house was restored to power, giving history the 8-year period known as the Restoration. In 1660, it was King William III, 1650–1702, a Stuart, and Queen Mary II. 1662–1694, who began in 1689 to rule England in a more modern fashion through Parliament. A Stuart descendant, George I, 1660–1727, established the House of Hanover, which originated in Germany. Queen Victoria, 1819–1901, who presided over the Victorian age, 1837–1901, was of the House of Hanover. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, 1841–1910, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg. Technically, this is the royal house still at the helm today. The name was changed to Windsor during World War I, 1914–18.
What were carpetbaggers?
Carpetbaggers was a derisive term that referred to northerners who arrived in the South in the early days of Reconstruction. 1865–77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861–65. Even though many of these northern businessmen intended to settle in the South, Southerners viewed them as outsiders and, worse, as opportunists who only intended to make a quick profit before returning north. They were called carpetbaggers because many carried carpetbags as luggage. Some Southerners even quipped that these Northerners could carry all their belongings in a carpetbag, implying that they were nothing more than transients. Nevertheless, Northerners who relocated to the South following the Civil War played an important role during Reconstruction. Some, aided by the black vote, gained public office and impacted state and local policy. But others proved to be corrupt. Because of the latter, the term carpetbagger became synonymous with a meddling, opportunistic outsider.
Why were Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella so powerful?
The 1469 marriage of Ferdinand, 1452–1516, and Isabella, 1451–1504, brought previously separate Spanish kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, under their joint control. Together the monarchs went on to rule Spain and expand their realm of influence until Isabella's death in 1504. Ferdinand ruled without his wife thereafter. Theirs was a reign that seemed to have religion on its side. In 1496 Pope Alexander VI conferred upon each of them the title Catholic, as in, Ferdinand the Catholic and Isabella the Catholic. And for good reason, because the kings and queens most well-known acts seem to have been motivated by their beliefs. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who in 1478 established the infamous Spanish Inquisition, a court that imprisoned or killed Catholics who were suspected of not following religious teachings. While the Inquisition was aimed at discovering and punishing Muslims and Jews who had converted to Catholicism but who were thought to be insincere, soon all Spaniards came to fear its power. In 1482 the monarchs undertook a war with the Muslim Moors, conquering the last Moorish stronghold at Granada in 1492, and forcing them back to Africa after 4 centuries of occupation and influence in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. The recovery of Iberia had been motivated by religion, when the king and queen expelled the Moors. They also believed they were expelling Islam from their kingdom. That year, 1492, was a fateful one for the Spanish. Not only were the Moors driven out, but Ferdinand and Isabella also turned their attention to the Jewish threat, expelling them, too. Those who remained went underground with their faith. Those Iberian Jews who migrated spread their division of Judaism, called Sephardim, to North Africa and the Middle East. Most students of history know 1492 best as the year that explorer Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, sailed to the New World. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who sponsored his voyage, believing that the conquered lands would not only add to their authority but would provide new territory for the spread of Catholicism. The Spaniards soon emerged as a formidable sea power in the Atlantic. For all their fervor, Isabella and Ferdinand were also interested in education and the arts, and they sponsored advances in both areas during their reign. Their legacy included their grandson Charles V, 1500 to 1558, who, through marriage, became Holy Roman Emperor and ruled from 1519 to 1558 as one of the all-powerful Habsburgs.
Why were Tsars Peter and Catherine known as the Great?
The epithet the Great can be misleading, while Romanov Tsars Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, are among the best known of the Romanov dynasty, and both had many accomplishments during their reigns. They are also known for having increased their power at the expense of others. Peter is recognized for introducing Western European civilization to Russia and for elevating Russia to the status of a great European power. But he also relied on the serfs, the peasants who were little more than indentured servants to the lords, not only to provide the bulk of the funding he needed to fight almost continuous wars, but for the manpower as well. Most soldiers were serfs. The man responsible for establishing schools, including the Academy of Sciences, reforming the calendar, and simplifying the alphabet also carried out ruthless reforms. Peter's most vainglorious act was, perhaps, to move the capital from Moscow to the city he had built for himself on the swampy land ceded by Sweden, St. Petersburg, known as Petrograd 1914-24, as Leningrad 1924-91. As his window on Europe, Peter succeeded in making the city into a brilliant cultural center. For her part, Catherine the Great may well be acknowledged as a patron of the arts and literature, one who corresponded with the likes of French writer Voltaire, 1694-1778, but she, too, increased the privileges of the nobility while making the lives of the serfs even more miserable. Her true colors were shown by how she ascended to power in the first place. In 1744 she married Peter III, who became Tsar of Russia in 1762. That same year, Catherine conspired with her husband's enemies to depose him. He was later killed. And so Catherine came to power, proclaiming herself Tsarina. She began her reign by attempting reforms, but a peasant uprising, 1773-74, and the French Revolution, which began in 1789, prompted her only to strengthen and protect her absolute authority. Like Peter the Great, she, too, extended the frontiers of the empire through a series of conquests. By the end of her reign, in 1796, Catherine had reduced even the free peasants to the level of serfdom.
When was modern Israel established?
As a modern state, Israel was formed by decree in 1948. In the wake of World War II, 1939-45. The United Nations, UN, formed a special committee to address the British control of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west. Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. The narrow piece of land comes to a point in the south, where it fronts the Gulf of Aqaba. In November 1947, the United Nations, UN, carved Israel out of the Palestine region. Areas of Palestine that were not designated as Israel were divided between neighboring Arab countries. Modern Israel's first leader, David Ben-Gurion, 1886 to 1973. Proclaimed an independent Israel on May 14, 1948. Born in Poland, Ben-Gurion had arrived in Palestine as a young man of about 20 and became extremely active in efforts to assert Jewish autonomy in the region. He served as Prime Minister from 1949 to 1953 and again between 1955 and 1963. But Israel's history goes back much farther than these 20th century events. And, having such a long history, it is also a complicated one. Israel was an ancient kingdom in Palestine, formed under King Saul in 1020 BC. Israel included the lands in Canaan, the promised land of the Hebrew tribes who descended from the people that Moses 14th–13th century BC led out of Egypt. But the kingdom was subsequently divided, and by the 8th century BC it had ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the area remained home and holy land to the Hebrews, Israelites, who had settled there. The entire region of Palestine, including the Kingdom of Israel, subsequently came under the control of various empires. Palestine saw the rule of the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, the Macedonians under Macedonian King Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. And the Romans. The area was the Roman province of Syria in the time of Jesus. After Roman rule, Palestine was, with only one exception, ruled by various Muslim Islamic dynasties, including the Ottoman Empire, 1516 to 1917. It was in 1917 that Palestine came under control of the British, who proclaimed in the Declaration of Balfour to support the establishment of a national home for the Jews living there. However, Britain reversed this policy in 1939. At the same time, the area was seeing an influx of Jewish people who were escaping persecution in Europe. Jews in Palestine opposed British control, and at the same time fighting intensified between Jews and Arabs. The 1947 decision by the Union to establish a Jewish homeland resulted in nearly 2 years of fighting between Israelis and Arabs in the region. And though boundaries among the various states were determined anew in 1949, fighting in the region continued with the Arab-Israeli wars of 1956, 1967, 1973–74, and 1982. Unrest prevailed throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, when the two sides began discussions to resolve the long conflict.
What is the G8?
It is the Group of Eight, an annual meeting of the world's leading industrial democracies. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It began as the Group of Six, with the 1975 conference in France, where representatives of 6 nations, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, met to discuss international economic and political issues. The goal of the meeting was to shore up cooperation on matters of concern to the member nations. Canada joined the group in 1976 and Russia in 1994, though the nation did not participate fully in the sessions until 1998. Hosting responsibilities rotate among the 8 member countries. In 2004, the United States hosted the 30th meeting, on an island off the coast of Georgia. Among the agenda items were the training of international peacekeepers, setting up a global initiative to develop a human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, vaccine, and developing a plan to end famine in the Horn of Africa. Easternmost Africa, including Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. By 2009, the leaders and representatives of non-G8 countries were invited to participate in discussions relevant to them.
Why was Mohandas Gandhi called Mahatma?
Mohandas Gandhi was called Mahatma, meaning great-souled, by the common people, who viewed him as India's national and spiritual leader. He is considered the father of his country. He was born in India on October 2, 1869. As a young man, Gandhi studied law in Britain. Practicing briefly in India, he then travelled to British-controlled South Africa on business. Observing oppressive treatment of Indian immigrants there, he held his first campaign of passive resistance. Gandhi would later become very well known for this method of protest. Called Satyagraha, meaning firmness in truth. Back in India as of 1915, Gandhi organized a movement of the people against the British government there. Britain had taken control of India during the 1700s and remained in power. After World War I, 1914-18, Indian nationalists fought what would be a long and sometimes bitter struggle for political independence. While Gandhi's protests took the form of nonviolent campaigns of civil disobedience, such as boycotts and fasts, hunger strikes, he was more than once arrested by the authorities for causing disorder. As his actions inspired more extreme measures on the part of his followers, whose protests took the form of rioting. As a member and, later, the president of India's chief political party, the Indian National Congress, Gandhi led a fight to rid the country of its rigid caste system, which organizes Indian society into distinct classes and groups. In Gandhi's time, not only were there 4 varna, or social classes, but there was a fifth group of untouchables who ranked even below the lowest class of peasants and laborers. Improving the lot of the untouchables was of tantamount importance to the leader, who by this time had abandoned Western ways in favor of a life of simplicity. Beginning in 1937, Gandhi became less active in government, giving up his official roles. But he continued to be regarded as a leader of the independence movement. During World War II, 1939–45, he was arrested for demanding British withdrawal from the conflict. Released from prison in 1944. Gandhi was central to the post-war negotiations that in 1947 resulted in an independent India. A believer in the unity of humankind under one God, he remained tolerant to Christian and Muslim beliefs. Amidst an outbreak of violence between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi was on a prayer vigil in New Delhi when a Hindu fanatic fatally shot him in 1948.
How did the House of Tudor originate?
The name of a royal family that ruled England for well over a century, from 1485 to 1603, came from a Welshman, Owen Tudor, who sometime after 1422 married Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437, the widow of Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. The family did not come to power until Henry VII ascended the throne. Ruling from 1485 until his death in 1509, Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, ended the bitter 30-year War of the Roses, during which two noble families, the houses of Lancaster and York, had struggled against each other for control of the throne. The conflict earned its name since the badge of each house depicted a rose, one red and the other white. In taking power, Henry VII became the head of the House of Lancaster, and in 1486 he married into the House of York, thus uniting the two former enemies and founding his own Tudor dynasty. He's known as Henry Tudor.
When did the United Nations begin its work?
The United Nations, UN, began fulfilling its mission very soon after it was chartered. The first meeting was held January 10, 1946, when the inaugural session of the General Assembly opened in London. On February 14, the UN voted to make its headquarters in the United States. Its complex was built in Manhattan, overlooking New York's East River, in 1950.
What is the Palestine Liberation Organization?
It is a group formed in 1964 by Arabs in Palestine, a region coextensive with the nation of Israel. Known as the PLO, the organization seeks to establish an area of self-rule for Muslims. Dominated by then guerrilla leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004. The PLO regarded Israel as an illegitimate state and became determined to establish a Palestinian state in the region. In 1974 the PLO was recognized by the United Nations and by Arab countries as the governing body of the Palestinian people. However, the Palestinians remained without a homeland and continued to fight for one, often resorting to terrorist tactics. In 1993 Israel and the PLO, still under Arafat's leadership, officially recognized each other. In an internationally brokered agreement, Israel agreed that by early 1996 it would withdraw its troops from the Gaza Strip, a tiny ribbon of land along the Mediterranean and bordering Egypt, and most cities and towns of the West Bank, a larger region lying west of the Jordan River and Dead Sea. The city of Jerusalem, recognized by both Israelis and Palestinians as their capitals, straddles the western border of the West Bank and is divided into an Arab East Jerusalem and a Jewish Israeli West Jerusalem. The 1993 Arab-Israeli Agreement, called the Oslo Accords, effectively carved out an autonomous Palestinian homeland, or at least an autonomous region. To govern this region, the Palestinian Authority, PA, was set up. In 1994 Arafat and Israeli leaders Yitzhak Rabin, 1922–1995, and Shimon Peres, 1923, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. In January 1996 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian-controlled parts of the West Bank elected a legislature and a president, Arafat, to govern these areas. But the accords foundered, both sides contributed to an escalation of violence in the long-troubled region. In 2003 the Roadmap for Peace, developed by the United States, in cooperation with Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, was presented to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA. The plan outlined clear goals and timelines for their achievement for both sides. Still the violence continued, with both sides failing to take the reciprocal steps necessary to peaceably coexist in the region. Cautious hopes for peace were again raised in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, who in January succeeded Arafat, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon met at an Egyptian resort for summit talks. The two announced a verbal ceasefire pledge. Sharon promised that the Israeli military would end assaults on Palestinians, and Abbas vowed to bring an end to militant attacks on Israelis. But there were obstacles to the agreement. Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip and West Bank needed to be dismantled. The Palestinians needed to gain control of the militant group Hamas, responsible for hundreds of acts of terrorism against Israelis, and the Israeli military needed to step down its responses. The Palestinian government remained tied to the PLO.
How many nations are members of the UN today?
In 2005 the United Nations, UN, membership stood at 191 nations, with the most recent additions having been Switzerland and Timor-Leste, East Timor, in 2002. The membership of the UN grew steadily after it was founded in 1945. Originally there were 51 member states, including Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the USSR, today the Russian Federation, and the United States. Within a decade, 25 more countries had been added to the UN's membership roster. By 1965 there were 117 members, by 1975 144 members, by 1985 159 members, and by 1995 185 members.
What was the Carolingian Empire?
The empire, which united most of Western Europe under a single leader from about 734 until 987, was named for the Carolingians, a family of Frankish kings. After the decline of the Roman Empire, in 476, various Germanic tribes, including the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Anglo-Saxons, dominated Western Europe, fighting each other as well as the advancing Muslims to protect and expand their territories. In 719 Charles Martel c. 688 to 741, united the lands of all the Franks under his rule. The Franks were the descendants of Germanic tribes who settled in the Rhine River region of Western Europe. He then went on to protect France from Arab incursion and campaigned against the Burgundians and the Frisians, eventually bringing them under his control. Upon his death in 741, Charles Martel was succeeded by his son, Pepin III. Known better perhaps as Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768. It was Pepin who established the Carolingian Empire and brought the Lombards into the empire. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his son Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814.
What was the Ottoman Empire?
It was a vast Turkish state founded in the 13th century by the Osmani Turks. Turks who were led by descendants of Osmani, 1258 c. 1326, by the middle of the next century, the Ottoman Empire consisted roughly of modern-day Turkey. The terms Turkey and Ottoman Empire are used interchangeably. The empire was expanded further by conquests during the 1400s, including the conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. At its height, the Byzantine Empire extended over an area that included the Balkan Peninsula, present-day Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece and Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, the northern coast of Africa, Palestine and parts of Arabia, Russia, and Hungary. The capital was placed at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey. Thus the Turks established a Muslim empire that would remain a formidable force and influence in the region and in Europe for the next 3 centuries. During the 1500s and 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful in the world. It reached its most glorious heights during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566. Who ruled from 1520 to 1566, it was he who added parts of Hungary to the Ottoman territory. He also tried to take Vienna, but failed. He did succeed in strengthening the Ottoman navy, which dominated the Mediterranean Sea. Suleiman was not only an expansionist, but a patron of the arts and a builder. He ordered the construction of mosques. To spread the Islamic religion throughout the empire, bridges, and other public works. But by the time World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline for some 300 years and only consisted of Asia Minor, parts of southwestern Asia, and part of the Balkan Peninsula. As one of the losing Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved in 1922 by the peace treaties that ended the war.
What does 40 acres and a mule mean?
The term originated with Union General William T. Sherman, 1820 to 1891, toward the end of the Civil War. On January 16, 1865, in his march to the sea, the military advancement he led from Atlanta to Savannah, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside a tract of land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts for the exclusive settlement of 40,000 freed slaves. According to the order, each black family was to be given a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. All of the lands were former plantations that had been confiscated during the war. They became the jurisdiction of the Freedmen's Bureau. Though there was a provision for one or more of the captured steamers to ply between the settlements and one or more of the commercial points, to sell the products of their land and labor. There was no mention of providing a mule, or any other animal, to each freedman. The mules, tired army work animals, were distributed later to the landholders. News of 40 acres and a mule spread among the freed slaves. But soon after the war ended in April 1865, this promised to materially assist. The freedman was abandoned when President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, issued pardons for the ex-Confederates and ordered their lands returned to them. The somewhat obscure term 40 acres and a mule resurfaced in the 1990s and early 2000s as the issue of reparations came to the fore in the United States.